Senator Pate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues, I speak today to Bill S-218 and in support of safeguards against use of the Notwithstanding clause. Thank you, Senator Harder, for this opportunity to examine what is at stake. Canadians will recall the proposals offered during this past election period that would, in defiance of rulings by the Supreme Court of Canada, increase parole ineligibility to ensure that some prisoners would only leave prison in a coffin. For good reason, the Notwithstanding clause has never been used with respect to matters of criminal law, and especially not to excuse cruel and unusual punishment. Indeed, in keeping with the intention that the Notwithstanding clause be invoked only in rare and extreme circumstances, it has never been used by the federal government. Despite the ludicrous actions south of our border, in Canada, it hopefully goes without saying that governments should not pass laws that are unconstitutional. The fact that some provinces have used the Notwithstanding clause to violate the rights of some Canadians is deeply problematic. I hope we all commit to the principle that this chamber should reject legislation that would use the Notwithstanding clause to salvage legislation that contravenes our constitutional values. Both this position and Bill S-218 restrictions on use of the Notwithstanding clause align with the crucial roles of this chamber as representatives of marginalized or minority groups and as reviewers of legislation with particular duties to uphold charter rights. My favorite illustration of our responsibilities as appointed rather than elected representatives in Canada's democratic system was expressed by our friend and colleague, the late Senator Murray Sinclair, when he reminded us that we must abide by the proverb that when two foxes and a chicken are voting on what to have for dinner, we will stand up for the chicken. Dr. Caitlin Salvino is one of countless legal experts to identify that the Notwithstanding clause magnifies injustice and inequality for those most marginalized. The checks meant to restrain its use by governments systemically exclude and disadvantage those whose rights are at greatest risks. First, while the designers of the Notwithstanding clause assumed that its use would generate significant scrutiny both in legislators and in the community, this scrutiny has not always occurred. And even with measures like Bill S-218, those most marginalized are least likely to have the financial resources to hire lobbyists, organize campaigns, litigate, or otherwise make their voices heard. Second, laws enacted using the Notwithstanding clause are valid for a maximum of 5 years, with a view to giving Canadians the opportunity to rethink unjust and unconstitutional practices. In practice, however, thoughtful reconsideration has not taken place. For example, in Quebec, Bill 21 used the Notwithstanding clause to require people, disproportionately Muslim women, to uncover their faces while receiving public services and to prevent public sector workers from wearing religious symbols, again disproportionately excluding Muslim women from working in a variety of public service jobs. Sadly, Quebec enacted Bill 21 and further inflamed anti-Muslim sentiments only 2 years after a man killed 6 people in a horrific mass shooting at the Great Mosque of Quebec, and the same year he was sentenced to an unconstitutional series of consecutive life sentences. When 5 years had passed and the time came to reenact the legislation, the bill passed the Quebec National Assembly with barely any pushback. Law professors Natasha Bacht and Linda Collins conclude, quote, "Time appears to have blunted our outrage against state-sanctioned discrimination and Islamophobia." Instead of galvanizing resistance to injustice and inequality, the 5-year time period apparently served to normalize it. Since the passage of Bill 21, Muslim women report increasingly hostile environments, including Islamophobic discrimination and physical threats and aggression, linked to the perception that, quote, "they do not belong in society," end quote. Law professors Bacht and Collins assert that this use of the Notwithstanding clause further marginalized and oppressed Muslim women, and that the clause cannot be employed as, quote, "a bottomless pit where rights and freedoms go to die." Instead, they argue it is a limited exception that must, like every other part of the Constitution, comport with the overarching structure of Canada's Constitution, including the unwritten constitutional principles of judicial independence, democracy, federalism, constitutionalism, and the rule of law, and respect for minorities. The Supreme Court confirmed in the City of Toronto case that unwritten constitutional principles are not subject to the Notwithstanding Clause. The text of Section 33 simply does not permit the undermining of core unwritten constitutional principles. In other words, in addition to the moral and political flaws, a legal and constitutional perspective negates the use of the Notwithstanding Clause to exacerbate inequality for marginalized groups. Though Bill S-218 would apply only to federal legislation, I note that Professors Bach and Collins are of the view that provinces and territories may be justified in using the Notwithstanding Clause if doing so would comport with constitutional principles. They cite as potentially valid use, which promotes minority rights, Quebec's choice to protect its laws requiring unilingual French commercial signage in the 1980s. I do wonder, however, whether a similar outcome could have been achieved without having to resort to the Notwithstanding Clause through recourse to Section 15, subsection 2 of the Charter, which permits affirmative action. Constitutional expert Marion Sandilands similarly asks why Section 1 of the Charter is not a sufficient response. Under this provision, known as the Justification Clause, protection of the French language in Quebec has previously been recognized as a, quote, pressing and substantial objective capable of justifying a charter infringement, end quote. Guillaume Rousseau and François Côté have attempted to justify, on the basis of Quebec's distinctiveness, Bill 21 and Bill 96, which contain unprecedented, total and preemptive overrides not just of the Canadian Charter, but also of Quebec's Charter. In response to their arguments, Ms. Sandilands states, quote, it is important to note that one can accept that Quebec's distinct language and culture should be protected in law, yet insist that this protection has not, does not, and ought not require the ousting of human rights charters. The protection of marginalized groups is particularly important in the context of the unconstitutional criminal law measures proposed to Canadian voters last election. Through this Chamber's work on human rights of prisoners, we heard, and Senator Clément's work on voting rights this election, and that she spoke to today, underscored that prisoners face abuse and oppression due to the lack of transparency and accountability about what is occurring in prisons. Prisoners' lack of access to financial resources and lawyers necessary to defend their rights, and their lack of voting clout. The use of the Notwithstanding Clause to subject people with few political or legal protections to draconian and lifelong sentences with no opportunity for parole would only serve to further dehumanize prisoners in ways that diminish all of our humanity. Consecutive life sentences with no chance of parole for upward of 50, 100, or 150 years are an American anomaly. Canada's harsh and potentially unconstitutional mandatory life sentences with parole ineligibility of 10 to 25 years already make us an outlier among comparable countries. Contrary to the rhetoric, all evidence reveals that restricting access to parole does not make us safer. Research by law professors Deborah Parks, Jane Sprott, and Isabel Grant confirms that when people serving life sentences are paroled, the vast majority are successful. In fact, returns to prison generally result from onerous administrative conditions related to release, not new offenses. Furthermore, as the body of evidence summarized by the Supreme Court in the Nur decision makes clear, harsh and inflexible minimum sentences do not deter crime. In the Bissonnette decision that struck down consecutive life sentences as unconstitutional, the Supreme Court of Canada recognized the protections against cruel and unusual punishments are bare minimum protection of our collective humanity. The inability of people to repay their full debt to society and to apply for reintegration and forgiveness strikes at the very foundations of our criminal justice system. A consecutive sentence is degrading in nature, that degrading in nature in that it presupposes at the time of its imposition that a person is beyond redemption and lacks the moral autonomy needed for rehabilitation. The court notes that these sentences amount to a death sentence by incarceration, something that Canada was supposed to have prohibited decades ago. The court also made clear that Canada can insist on limits on parole ineligibility as part of a human rights-informed and constitutionally compliant criminal legal system without devaluing the humanity of victims of crime or condoning horrific acts. The idea of denouncing multiple murders more strongly by imposing a sentence that reflects the value of each human life that was lost is based on a retributivist approach. However, as Professors Desrosiers and Bernard put it, in a legal system based on respect for rights and freedoms, the eye for an eye principle does not apply. The courts must establish a limit on the state's power to sanction in keeping with our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The horror of the crimes does not negate the basic proposition that all human beings carry within them a capacity for rehabilitation, and that accordingly punishments which fail to account for this human quality will offend the principles that underlie Section 12 of our Charter. Normalizing consecutive life sentences as punishment risks ratcheting up and encouraging harsher sentences across the board, increasing acceptance and expectations of cruelty in prisons, in court, and in society, and thereby eroding the rights that protect all of us. This election period, some politicians suggested using the Notwithstanding clause to encourage sentences that would ensure that people only ever left prisons in a coffin. These measures are ineffective and extremely costly in both human and financial terms. Worse yet, they are disproportionately experienced by Indigenous, Black, and poor people, as well as those suffering from disabling mental health issues. In short, they are a Trumpian slap in the face to Canadian principles of justice. In fact, the Sentencing Project in the United States has underscored the reality that such approaches are rooted in racist and ableist theories promoting eugenics. As eugenics thinking rose to prominence in Nazi Germany in the early 20th century, U.S. jurisdictions were also enacting so-called habitual offender or three-strikes laws, providing for permanent incarceration of those characterized as being prone to, quote, criminality, with the stated goal of separating these individuals from society and preventing them from having children. Similar measures were repealed in Germany following the Second World War. In the United States, with few amendments, these laws remain on the books a century later in 49 states and federally. This is not the way forward for Canada. It is time to push back on incursions on our collective human and charter rights wherever they occur. We can begin by relegating to a shameful chapter in our history books attempts to use the Notwithstanding clause to excuse, condone, or celebrate cruelty and inequality. I hope you join in this fight. Miigwech, merci, thank you.
Senator Batters.
Would Senator Pate take a question? Thank you.
Senator.
In the Bissonnette case that you referred to, just in case people aren't familiar, that is the case where Alexandre Bissonnette was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder. He went into a mosque in 2017. He was 27 years old at the time. He murdered 6 Muslim men who were there to pray. And he received, the Crown sought to have him not have a 25-year parole eligibility wait for each of those 6 lives that he took, but they sought to have the court impose a 50-year wait for parole eligibility. So he would have been potentially 77 at the time that he got out from those years of sentence, but the Supreme Court of Canada overturned that. In that sort of case, what the Supreme Court of Canada then effectively found is that because consecutive sentences for that situation were unconstitutional, the most that could be given to somebody for a sentence of first-degree murder, no matter how many people they killed in that spree that they had, is 25 years wait for parole eligibility. Do you think that that is sufficient?
Senator.
Not 25-year sentence, it's a life sentence. And in order to actually get out, you have to apply to the parole board, and there are many hurdles to getting, not just to the parole board, but also to getting out. And I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who are serving life sentences, even where they had defenses or had wrongful convictions, David Milgaard being one, Junior Marshall
Senator Pate, I'm sorry, is it your time for debate is expired? Are you asking for more time to answer the question?
Yes, please. Yeah, right.
So I haven't asked the question, but I see that you're a lot. You can answer the question.
Great, thank you. So, in fact, there are many people serving life sentences who never get out. And those serving multiple life sentences or those who have been convicted of multiple murders are often among those groups. I can't think of anybody who has killed more than 1, 2, or 3 people who is out who we don't already know are dangerous. And so the reality is we actually do a disservice to Canadians, in my humble opinion, by saying people are only getting 25-year sentences. In fact, those are even outliers in many other jurisdictions, Western jurisdictions. In some cases, like Portugal, it's unconstitutional to even give a life sentence. And so in many of the European countries, a long sentence is 10 years. And so here we have people serving life sentences. That means they could die in prison. And what the Supreme Court of Canada said in Bissonnette is there should be some hope of redemption. There should be some hope that people could get out. And in fact, when the parole and eligibility was increased from 10 years to 25 years with the abolishment of capital punishment, there was actually a provision put in place. And the last time the Supreme Court of Canada looked at the life sentence alone, they actually questioned whether it would be constitutional, but for the faint hope clause, which, as you know, was abolished in 2012. So, in fact, we are still seen as an outlier with a parole and eligibility period of 25 years for and a life sentence.